Welcome to our video on how to write clean code by following the do's and don'ts of naming variables, functions, and classes. As a programmer, you know that writing code is not just about making it work, but also about making it readable, maintainable, and understandable by others, including your future self. One of the key aspects of writing clean code is using meaningful and consistent names for the elements of your code, such as variables that hold values, functions that perform operations, and classes that organize data and behavior. In this video, we will explore some of the best practices and common mistakes when it comes to naming and coding, and show you examples and tips that you can apply to your own projects. Whether you're a beginner or an experienced developer, this video will help you improve your coding skills and make your code cleaner and more efficient. So, let's dive in. Use meaningful and descriptive names. The first principle of naming is to use meaningful and descriptive names that accurately describe what they represent. This makes the code more readable and easier to understand for other developers. For example, instead of naming a variable num, we should use a descriptive name such as number of students. Instead of naming a function calculate, use a name that accurately describes what this function calculates, such as calculate circle area. Instead of naming a Boolean variable, bool, or empty, we should use a descriptive name such as is logged in. Moreover, this looks nice inside of an if statements like if is empty. Avoid misleading names. The second principle of naming is to avoid misleading names that can be confusing to other developers. For example, naming a variable first name when it actually contains the last name of a person. Naming a function getCustomerInfo when it actually returns the customer ID. Naming a variable available when it actually contains the count of available items. Be consistent. The third principle of naming is to be consistent in the naming conventions used throughout the codebase. This helps to make the code more readable and easier to understand. For example, if we use camel case for variable names, we should use it consistently throughout the codebase. If we use underscores to separate words in variable names, we should use it consistently throughout the codebase. Another tricky example is naming a function for getting user data, get user data, and another function that updates the user data is update user info. This should be update user data instead. Use clear and concise names. The fourth principle of naming is to use clear and concise names that avoid unnecessary words or abbreviations. This makes the code more readable and easier to understand for other developers. For example, instead of naming a variable number of students in class, we can use a more concise name such as class size. Instead of naming a function, calculate area of rectangle using length and width, we can use a more concise name such as calculate rectangle area. Instead of naming a variable number, we can use a more clear and concise name such as total count. Use pronounceable names. The fifth principle of naming is to use pronounceable names that are easy to say out loud. This makes it easier to discuss code with other developers. For example, instead of naming a variable HSH, we can use a more pronounceable name such as hash. Instead of naming a function strcnctn, we can use a more pronounceable name such as string concatenation. Instead of naming a variable JSONObj, we can use a more pronounceable name such as JSONObject. Use searchable names. The sixth principle of naming is to use names that are easy to search for, making it easier to find specific code. For example, instead of naming a variable count, we can use a more searchable name such as number of students. This way you can easily use your IDE to find the number of students. Another example is naming a constant pi. We can use a more searchable name such as pi value. Avoid encoding information in names. The seventh principle of naming is to avoid encoding information such as data types or scopes in names, as this information can be conveyed through other means. Also, modern IDEs make it simple to distinguish between various types of variables. For example, instead of naming a variable str name, we can use a more generic name such as username. Instead of naming a variable int product price, we can use a more generic name such as product price. Use domain-specific names. The eighth principle of naming is to use names that are specific to the domain you're working in, as this can make the code easier to understand for others in that domain. For example, if we're working on a project related to finance, we can use names such as transaction, balance, and credit score. If we're working on a project related to e-commerce, we can use names such as shopping cart, product, and order, and so on. By following these principles, we can write code that is more readable, maintainable, and understandable by other developers. And now, how about you? Do you have any additional tips or examples for writing clear and meaningful names in your code? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this video helpful, give us a virtual high five by hitting that like button and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more great content. Thanks for tuning in.